On a warm September morning in 1988, in the high desert town of Farmington, New Mexico, a young woman named Patricia Torres walked out of her small adobe-style home on East Main Street and never returned. She was 23 years old, a bank teller with dark hair she wore in a ponytail, a woman who called her mother every Sunday without fail. Her car sat in the driveway, keys on the kitchen counter. Her purse rested on the dining room table, wallet inside, $37 in cash still tucked in the billfold. The front door had been left standing open, and for 34 years, no one could say with certainty what happened to Patricia Torres in the hours between sunrise and noon on September 17, 1988. The question that haunted Farmington was simple, terrible, and seemingly unanswerable. Where did she go? Farmington sits in the northwestern corner of New Mexico, where the high desert meets the foothills of the Chusca Mountains. In 1988, it was a town of roughly 35,000 people, built on oil, gas, and the kind of tight-knit community bonds that form when you live somewhere the rest of the world forgets about. The San Juan River cut through the landscape like a promise, bringing cottonwood trees and green spaces to an otherwise brown and dusty terrain. Main Street ran east to west through the old part of town, lined with small businesses that had been there for generations. Hardware stores with wooden floors, diners that served green chili with everything. The kind of place where people knew their neighbors, left doors unlocked, and expected tomorrow to look much like yesterday. Patricia Torres had lived in Farmington her entire life. Born at San Juan Regional Medical Center in May of 1965, she grew up in a modest home on the south side of town with her parents, Miguel and Rosa Torres, and her younger brother, Danny. Miguel worked at the power plant. Rosa cleaned houses for families in the nicer neighborhoods near the country club. They attended St. Mary's Catholic Church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew they'd claimed when Patricia was baptized. Patricia had been a quiet child, her teachers said. Observant. She drew pictures of horses and desert landscapes in the margins of her notebooks. She graduated from Farmington High School in 1983 with decent grades and no clear sense of what came next. She took a job as a teller at First National Bank downtown, working the morning shift Monday through Friday. The work was steady, predictable. She counted money, processed deposits, smiled at customers who'd known her since she was small. She lived alone in a small rental house on East Main, a single-story structure with a flat roof, and a small yard enclosed by a chain-link fence. The house had been painted turquoise once, but the desert sun had faded it to something closer to gray. She kept the place tidy. A small television sat on a stand in the living room. A bookshelf held romance novels and a few books about art. In the kitchen, she had a calendar hanging on the wall where she marked appointments with careful handwriting. Patricia had a routine, and routines matter in stories like this because they establish what normal looked like before everything changed. She woke at 6:30 each morning, made coffee in a percolator on the stove, ate toast with butter, sometimes with jam. She showered, dressed in the professional clothing the bank required, blouses, skirts that fell below the knee, sensible shoes. She left her house at 7:45, walking the 6 blocks to the bank, arriving precisely at 8 o'clock when the doors unlocked for employees. She was never late. Her supervisor would later tell investigators that Patricia Torres was the most reliable person on staff. Clear's throat. September 17, 1988 was a Saturday. Patricia wasn't scheduled to work. The sun rose over Farmington at 6:42 that morning, casting long shadows across the empty streets. The temperature would climb to 84 degrees by afternoon. There was no wind. The sky stretched pale and cloudless from horizon to horizon. Patricia's neighbor, an elderly man named Arthur Salazar who lived in the house immediately to the south, would later tell deputies that he saw Patricia that morning around 7:30. She was watering the small patch of grass in her front yard with a green garden hose. She wore jeans and a white t-shirt. Her hair was down, falling past her shoulders. She waved at him. He waved back. He went inside to make his breakfast and didn't think about it again until much later. At approximately 8:15 that morning, Patricia's mother, Rosa, called the house. The phone rang and rang, 14 times by Rosa's count, before she hung up. Rosa wasn't worried yet. Perhaps Patricia had gone to the grocery store. Perhaps she'd walked downtown to the diner for breakfast. Rosa went about her morning. She cleaned the kitchen. She folded laundry. She called again at 9:30. Again, no answer. This time, a small seed of concern took root. Patricia always answered the phone on Saturday mornings. They had a standing tradition. Rosa would call, and they would talk about the week, make plans for Sunday dinner after church. By 10 o'clock, Rosa Torres was in her car, driving across town to her daughter's house. The drive took 11 minutes. She pulled up in front of the turquoise house and immediately saw that something was wrong. The front door stood open, not wide but enough to see into the dark interior. The screen door hung loose on its hinges, moving slightly in what little breeze existed. Rosa got out of her car, calling her daughter's name. No response. She walked up the short concrete path to the door, called again, stepped inside. The house was empty, silent. Rosa moved through the rooms with increasing urgency. The kitchen looked normal, a coffee cup in the sink, a plate with toast crumbs on the counter. The living room was undisturbed. The bedroom showed a made bed, clothes folded neatly on a chair. But Patricia was gone. Her purse sat on the dining room table, contents visible when Rosa looked inside. The wallet, the cash, the identification card with Patricia's photo. Her car keys lay on the counter beside the coffee maker. The car itself sat in the driveway, driver's side door locked. Rosa Torres stood in the center of her daughter's living room and felt the world tilt. She walked back outside, looking up and down the street. A few houses away, someone was mowing a lawn. A dog barked, the ordinary sounds of a Saturday morning. She walked to Arthur Salazar's house and knocked on his door. He answered, and Rosa asked if he'd seen Patricia. He repeated what he'd seen. The young woman watering her grass, the wave, nothing more. Rosa went back to her daughter's house and called the police. The Farmington Police Department received Rosa Torres' call at 10:38 that morning. The dispatcher noted the address, the missing person's name and age, the circumstances as described by the worried mother. A patrol unit was dispatched. Officers arrived at 10:51. They walked through the house, noting the same details Rosa had observed. Nothing appeared disturbed. No signs of struggle. No broken windows, no overturned furniture. The door had been left open, but there was no evidence of forced entry. The officers asked Rosa about Patricia's habits, her friends, any recent problems or concerns. Rosa told them her daughter lived a quiet life. She worked at the bank. She attended church. She had a few friends from high school she occasionally met for lunch. She didn't have a boyfriend currently, though she dated someone briefly the year before. Nothing had seemed wrong or unusual. Clear as throat, by noon, more officers had arrived. A detective named Raymond Cordova took over the case. He was 43 years old, a 16-year veteran of the department, a man with gray hair beginning to show at his temples and a reputation for thoroughness. He walked the property, inside and out. He examined the open door, the undisturbed interior, the car in the driveway. He spoke with Arthur Salazar, confirming the timeline. He knocked on doors up and down East Main Street, asking if anyone had seen Patricia Torres that morning, if anyone had heard anything unusual. Most neighbors had seen nothing. One woman 2 houses down thought she'd heard a vehicle around 8:30 or 9, but she couldn't be certain. Vehicles came and went on Main Street all the time. Detective Cordova returned to the house and stood in the living room, studying the space. For those who have ever entered a place where someone should be and found only absence, you understand the particular quality of that silence. It's not peaceful. It's wrong. He noted the coffee cup in the sink, the toast crumbs, evidence that Patricia had eaten breakfast. He opened the refrigerator, milk, eggs, leftovers in a covered dish. He checked the bathroom, toothbrush in the holder, towel hanging on the rack. He went into the bedroom and opened the closet. Clothes hung neatly, shoes lined up below. On the dresser, a jewelry box sat closed. He opened it. Inexpensive pieces inside, a few pairs of earrings, a silver chain, a ring that looked like it might have been from high school. The detective stood there for a long moment, looking at that jewelry box. If someone had taken Patricia Torres, they hadn't taken anything else. They hadn't rifled through her belongings. They hadn't stolen her cash or her car. They'd simply taken her. Part 2. The investigation, the search for Patricia Torres, began in earnest that afternoon. Detective Cordova organized teams of officers and volunteers to canvass the neighborhood in expanding circles from her house. They knocked on every door within a 6-block radius. They searched vacant lots, alleyways, the brushy areas along the irrigation ditches that ran through town. They walked the riverbank, looking for any sign of disturbance. The San Juan River moved slow and brown in late September, shallow enough in places to see the bottom. They found nothing. By Sunday morning, word had spread through Farmington. Patricia Torres was missing. The young woman from the bank, the quiet girl who'd grown up here, had vanished from her home in broad daylight. People gathered at St. Mary's after services, talking in hushed voices. Rosa Torres sat in her usual pew and wept. Miguel Torres stood beside her, a man who worked with his hands and didn't know what to do with them now. Danny Torres, Patricia's younger brother, was 20 years old and home from technical school in Albuquerque. He stood outside the church after Mass, smoking cigarettes and staring at nothing. The Farmington Daily Times ran a front-page story on Monday morning. "Local woman missing since Saturday," read the headline. The article included a photograph of Patricia, her employee photo from the bank, showing a young woman with dark hair and a slight smile, wearing a blue blouse. The article asked anyone with information to contact the police department. Tips began coming in, the way they always do. Someone thought they'd seen her at the grocery store. Someone else was certain they'd spotted her getting into a truck near the highway. Detective Cordova and his team followed every lead. None led anywhere. The investigation in those first days focused on reconstructing Patricia's movements and identifying anyone who might have had reason to harm her. Detectives interviewed her coworkers at the bank. Everyone described her the same way: quiet, reliable, friendly, but private. She'd never mentioned problems with customers. She'd never expressed fear of anyone. Her supervisor provided work schedules showing Patricia hadn't been at the bank on Saturday. Detectives spoke with her friends from high school. Most had lost touch with her over the years, seeing her only occasionally around town. None knew of any trouble in her life. The ex-boyfriend from the previous year was located and interviewed. His name was Martin Herrera, a mechanic who worked at a garage on the west side of town. He told detectives the relationship had been brief, lasting only 3 months before mutually ending. No hard feelings, he said. He provided an alibi for Saturday morning. He'd been at work, overhauling an engine. His boss confirmed this. Detectives noted his cooperation and moved on. Arthur Salazar, the neighbor who'd seen Patricia that morning, was interviewed multiple times. He repeated his account consistently. He'd seen her watering the grass around 7:30. She'd waved. He'd gone inside. He heard nothing unusual after that. He was 71 years old, a widower who spent his days tending his own small garden and watching television. Detectives found nothing to suggest his involvement. Clear's throat as the investigation progressed. A particular detail began to trouble Detective Cordova. He stood in Patricia's house on the 3rd day of the search, looking at that open door again. The door opened inward into the house. The screen door opened outward. For the main door to be standing open the way Rosa Torres had found it, someone had to have opened it from the inside. If Patricia had left the house voluntarily, she would have closed the door behind her. If someone had forced their way in, there would be signs of that force. But there were no signs of struggle, no damaged locks, no indication of confrontation. Those who knew him said Detective Cordova had a mind that worked through problems methodically, turning them over like stones to see what lay beneath. He sat at his desk in the police department and reviewed the timeline again. Arthur Salazar saw Patricia at 7:30. Rosa Torres called at 8:15 and got no answer. Rosa arrived at 10 and found the door open. Somewhere in that window of time, Patricia Torres had left her house or been taken from it. The detective drew a map of the neighborhood, marking distances, noting sight lines. East Main Street ran through a residential area with houses closed together. Someone taking Patricia against her would have had to do it quickly, quietly, in a way that attracted no attention on a Saturday morning when people were home, when someone might look out a window at any moment. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves in the days that followed. The investigation was hitting walls. There were no witnesses beyond Arthur Salazar. There was no physical evidence, no blood, no torn clothing, no signs of violence. Patricia's fingerprints were throughout her house, of course, but so were her mother's from that morning, and Arthur Salazar's from times he'd visited, and various others from friends and family over the years. The house gave up no secrets. On the 5th day of the investigation, Detective Cordova made a decision. He brought in search dogs. German shepherds trained in tracking, handled by officers from the state police. The dogs were given items of Patricia's clothing to establish her scent. They were brought to the house and released. The first dog immediately moved to the front door, then out to the yard. It followed a trail to the sidewalk, turned left, moved approximately 40 feet down the street and stopped. The dog circled, searching, then sat down. The scent trail ended there. The second dog did the same thing, following the path to the exact same spot. The handlers interpreted this to mean Patricia had gotten into a vehicle at that location. Someone had picked her up or taken her and driven away. Detective Cordova stood on that spot on East Main Street, 40 feet from Patricia Torres' house, and looked back at her door. He imagined a vehicle pulling up, the door opening, Patricia walking out, willingly or otherwise, getting in, the vehicle driving away. But why would she leave her purse, her keys, her car? If she'd gone willingly, she'd taken nothing with her. If someone had forced her, they'd done it without anyone noticing, without leaving a trace. The detective expanded the investigation. He obtained records from the phone company, documenting calls made to and from Patricia's residence. The most recent calls were from her mother. Before that, a call to the bank on Friday afternoon, lasting 3 minutes. Patricia had called to confirm her schedule for the following week. A few days earlier, a call to a friend, a brief conversation about meeting for lunch sometime. Nothing unusual. He checked with the post office. Her mail had been normal, bills and advertisements. He checked with utility companies. All accounts current, no issues. He checked with the bank where she worked. Her employee records showed nothing of concern. She'd never been written up, never had complaints, never called in sick excessively. As September turned into October, the investigation began to slow. The initial burst of activity, the volunteers searching, the tips coming in, the media attention, all of it gradually faded. The Farmington Daily Times ran follow-up stories, but they moved from the front page to inside sections. Detective Cordova continued working the case, but he had other cases too, other crimes that demanded attention. The Torres family remained in agony. Rosa Torres called the police department daily, asking for updates. Miguel Torres drove through town at odd hours, searching, though he couldn't have said what he was searching for. Danny Torres went back to technical school but couldn't concentrate, eventually withdrawing from his classes. The case went cold, not officially but practically. There were no new leads. No witnesses came forward. No remains were found. Patricia Torres had simply vanished, and Farmington, New Mexico, was left with a mystery that had no resolution. Those who have lived in small towns understand how a thing like this changes a place. The sense of safety dissolves. Parents hold their children closer. Doors that were once left unlocked get bolted. And people begin to tell themselves stories to make sense of the senseless. She must have run away. She must have had a secret life. She must have gotten into trouble with the wrong people. Anything to avoid the more frightening truth, that sometimes people disappear and no one knows why, and nothing makes sense. Part 3. The silence. The calendar turned to 1989, and Patricia Torres remained missing. Detective Cordova kept the file on his desk, adding notes periodically when something occurred to him, but there was nothing new to add. The file grew thin with inactivity. In March of that year, a rancher found human remains in a remote area northeast of Farmington, and for 3 terrible days, the Torres family believed they would finally have answers. DNA testing, which was still relatively new in 1989, determined the remains belonged to someone else, a case from years earlier. The Torres family's hope, briefly kindled, turned back to ash. Rosa and Miguel Torres tried to continue their lives. Miguel went to work at the power plant. Rosa cleaned houses. They attended church, though Rosa found no comfort there anymore. She would sit in the pew and stare at the altar and feel nothing but a vast emptiness where her daughter used to be. Miguel stopped talking much. He'd always been a quiet man, but now his silence had a different quality. Heavy, impenetrable. At night, Rosa would wake and find his side of the bed empty. She'd find him sitting in the kitchen in the dark, smoking cigarettes, staring at nothing. Danny Torres, the younger brother, moved back home. He couldn't stay in Albuquerque, couldn't focus on classes or exams when his sister was missing. He got a job working construction, framing houses in the new development spreading across the west side of Farmington. He worked long hours, came home exhausted, and still couldn't sleep. He had dreams about Patricia. In them, she was always just out of reach, calling for him, and he couldn't get to her. He'd wake up with his heart pounding, sheets soaked with sweat. The family moved through months, and then years in a strange, suspended state. They couldn't grieve properly because there was no body, no confirmation, no funeral. They couldn't move forward because moving forward felt like giving up. They existed in a limbo that anyone who has lost someone without resolution will recognize. The not knowing becomes its own kind of presence, a weight that never lifts. Clear's throat. In 1991, the Farmington Police Department received a tip. A woman called, refusing to give her name, saying she'd seen Patricia Torres in Durango, Colorado, working at a restaurant. Detective Cordova, still carrying the case, drove the 45 miles to Durango and spent 2 days checking every restaurant in town. He found nothing. He showed Patricia's photograph to dozens of people. No one recognized her. He drove back to Farmington and added another note to the file. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, or sensed that something was wrong but couldn't name it, you understand the particular torture of the Torres family during these years. They wanted to believe Patricia was alive somewhere, that she'd started a new life, that she was happy. But the evidence argued against it. She'd left everything behind. She'd taken no money, no identification, nothing that would help someone start over. And Patricia hadn't been the kind of person who ran away. Everyone who knew her said so. She was responsible, connected to her family, content with her quiet life. The narrative of escape didn't fit. By 1995, 7 years after Patricia's disappearance, the case was effectively closed. Not officially, but in practical terms. Detective Cordova had retired. The file had been transferred to a new detective, then to another, then filed away in the cold case archives. The Torres family had learned to live with the absence. Rosa Torres had aged a decade in those 7 years. Miguel Torres had developed heart problems, stress manifesting in physical symptoms. Danny Torres had married and started a family of his own, but he named his first daughter Patricia, and sometimes his wife would catch him staring at the baby, with an expression of such profound sadness that she didn't know what to say. The town moved on the way towns do. New people moved in who'd never heard of Patricia Torres. Young people grew up with her disappearance as distant history, something their parents might mention occasionally. The turquoise house on East Main Street changed hands multiple times. The memory faded, became less sharp, less immediate. In small towns, mysteries become legends, and legends become ghost stories, and eventually, they're just part of the landscape. But in 2002, something shifted. Danny Torres, now 34 years old and working as a construction supervisor, attended a conference in Albuquerque about cold cases and DNA technology. He sat in a hotel conference room and listened to forensic specialists talk about advances in genetic testing, about cases being solved decades after the crimes occurred. He listened to a presentation about databases, about how unidentified remains could be matched with missing persons through DNA comparison. He drove back to Farmington that evening with something he hadn't felt in years, a small, dangerous spark of hope. He contacted the Farmington Police Department. He spoke with the current chief, explained who he was, what case he was asking about. He requested that Patricia's case be reviewed in light of new technology. The chief was sympathetic but realistic. Without remains, DNA testing couldn't help. Without new evidence, there was nothing to retest. Danny persisted. He asked them to reopen the investigation, to look at it with fresh eyes. The chief promised to assign someone to review the file. A detective named Sarah Martinez took on the cold case review in early 2003. She was 31 years old, relatively new to the department, and she approached the file without the burden of having lived through the original investigation. She read through every report, every interview, every note Detective Cordova had made. She studied the timeline. She looked at photographs of Patricia's house, the open door, the undisturbed interior. She read Arthur Salazar's statement. The old neighbor had passed away in 1997, but his testimony remained in the file. She made notes of her own, questions that occurred to her as she reviewed the material. One detail caught her attention. In the original investigation, Detective Cordova had documented that the search dogs had tracked Patricia's scent from her house to a spot 40 feet down the street, where the trail ended. Detective Martinez obtained a map of the neighborhood and marked that location. She studied the houses visible from that spot. She looked at which windows faced the street, which yards had sight lines. Then she began the painstaking work of tracking down people who'd lived on that block in 1988, seeing if anyone remembered anything they hadn't reported at the time. Part 4. The revelation detective Martinez worked the cold case quietly, without fanfare, conducting interviews when she could between her regular caseload. In June of 2003, she located a woman named Carol Henderson who'd lived on East Main Street in 1988, 3 houses down from Patricia Torres. Carol had been 41 then, a nurse who worked night shifts at the hospital. She'd been interviewed briefly during the original investigation, and had told police she'd been sleeping during the morning hours when Patricia disappeared. Detective Martinez called and asked if she could speak with her again, just to see if any details had surfaced in her memory over the years. They met at a coffee shop in Farmington. Carol Henderson was now 56, still working as a nurse, though she'd moved to day shifts. Detective Martinez asked her to think back to September 17, 1988. Carol said she tried not to think about it for years. It haunted her, she said, the fact that a woman had disappeared practically from her doorstep and no one had seen anything. But then Carol said something that made Detective Martinez set down her coffee cup and lean forward. Carol said she actually hadn't been asleep that morning. She'd gotten home from her shift around 7, but she'd been too wired to sleep right away, the way night shift workers often are. She'd taken a shower, made breakfast, and sat at her kitchen table drinking coffee and looking out the window. And she'd seen Patricia Torres watering her grass. She'd seen Arthur Salazar wave at her. She'd seen Patricia go back inside her house. And then, maybe 15 or 20 minutes later, she'd seen a vehicle pull up in front of Patricia's house. Detective Martinez asked her to describe the vehicle. Carol closed her eyes, concentrating. A truck, she said. Dark-colored, maybe blue or black. Not new, but not old. A working truck, The kind men drove to job sites. She couldn't remember the make or model. She hadn't paid that much attention at the time. But she remembered that someone got out of the truck and walked to Patricia's door. She couldn't see well enough to describe the person. The angle was wrong, there were trees partially blocking her view. But she'd watched the person knock, wait, knock again. Then Patricia had opened the door. Detective Martinez asked if Carol had seen Patricia leave with this person. Carol said she couldn't be certain. She'd looked away for a moment, distracted by something in her own kitchen, and when she looked back, the truck was pulling away. She'd assumed Patricia had gotten in, but she hadn't actually seen it happen. Detective Martinez asked the critical question. Why hadn't Carol reported this during the original investigation? Carol's face flushed. She said she had mentioned it, but the officer who interviewed her, she couldn't remember his name, had seemed to think it wasn't important. Men came and went from the neighborhood all the time. Delivery trucks, service vehicles, friends visiting. He'd asked if she'd seen Patricia actually get into the truck, and when Carol said no, he'd noted it down and moved on. Carol had assumed they'd followed up on it. She hadn't realized her information had been essentially lost in the mass of tips and statements collected that first week. Clear's throat, Detective Martinez returned to the police department and pulled every file related to the Torres case. She found Carol Henderson's original statement, a single page among hundreds. The officer who'd taken it had written, "Subject reports possible vehicle on street morning of incident. Unable to confirm victim entered vehicle or identify driver. No plate number obtained." The statement had been filed and apparently never pursued further. This was not negligence exactly, but rather the reality of investigations where dozens of people report seeing vehicles, strangers, unusual activity. Without specific identifying information, the lead hadn't seemed actionable at the time, but Detective Martinez saw it differently. The timeline mattered. Carol Henderson had seen a truck pull up approximately 15 to 20 minutes after Patricia finished watering her grass. If Arthur Salazar had seen Patricia around 7:30, and Carol had seen the truck between 7:45 and 8 o'clock, that matched with Rosa Torres calling at 8:15 and getting no answer. Patricia could have left with whoever was in that truck. The question was who? Detective Martinez began a new phase of investigation. She pulled records of every registered truck in San Juan County in 1988. The list was enormous, thousands of vehicles. She narrowed it by color, searching for dark blue or black trucks. Still too many. She looked at the original investigation files again, studying every person who'd been interviewed, looking for mentions of vehicles. She cross-referenced names with vehicle registrations. She worked nights and weekends on this, driven by the sense that she was close to something. In September of 2003, 15 years almost to the day after Patricia Torres disappeared, Detective Martinez found a connection. She'd been reviewing statements from Patricia's coworkers at the bank, and one name appeared repeatedly in the context of maintenance and repairs. The bank had used a local handyman for various work throughout the 1980s, fixing plumbing, replacing light fixtures, general building maintenance. The handyman's name was Leonard Watkins. He was 59 years old in 1988, a quiet man who lived alone on the far west side of Farmington. According to bank records, Leonard Watkins had performed work at the bank as recently as September 13, 1988, 4 days before Patricia disappeared. Detective Martinez ran Leonard Watkins through the system. He had no criminal record. He'd lived in Farmington since 1975, when he'd moved from Texas following a divorce. He'd worked as a handyman and general laborer, picking up jobs around town. He owned a 1982 Chevrolet truck, dark blue. Detective Martinez felt something click into place. She pulled his DMV photo from 1988. A thin man with receding gray hair, wearing glasses, expression neutral. She began asking questions about Leonard Watkins. She spoke with people who'd hired him for work. Most described him as competent, quiet, reliable. A few mentioned he seemed lonely. One woman said he'd made her uncomfortable once, standing too close while discussing a repair, but nothing had happened and she dismissed it. Detective Martinez learned that Leonard Watkins had continued living in Farmington, still doing odd jobs, still driving his truck. He was now 74 years old. On October 8, 2003, Detective Martinez knocked on the door of Leonard Watkins's mobile home on County Road 350. He answered, looking older than his photograph, more frail. She identified herself and asked if she could speak with him about Patricia Torres. Leonard Watkins stood in the doorway for a long moment, and those who have conducted interrogations say you can sometimes see the moment when someone decides whether to lie or tell the truth. His shoulders dropped. He said, "I've been waiting for someone to come." He invited her inside. The mobile home was neat but sparse, furniture from decades ago, walls bare except for a calendar. They sat at a small kitchen table. Detective Martinez asked Leonard Watkins to tell her what happened on September 17, 1988. He looked at his hands, age-spotted and trembling slightly. Then he began to speak. He said he'd known Patricia from working at the bank. He'd seen her there, thought she was pretty, thought she seemed kind. He'd driven by her house a few times, not stalking exactly, but wanting to see where she lived. On that Saturday morning, he'd been driving through town and had seen her in her yard. He'd stopped, gotten out, walked to her door. He knocked. She opened it, recognized him from the bank. He asked if she needed any work done around the house. She was polite but said no, everything was fine. He said he'd asked if he could come in just for a moment to give her his phone number in case she ever needed repairs. She'd hesitated, but she'd been too polite to refuse. That politeness, he said, that's what haunted him. She'd let him in. They'd stood in the living room. He'd written his number on a piece of paper from his pocket, and then something had come over him, he said. He'd reached out and touched her hair. She'd stepped back, alarmed. He'd apologized, said he didn't know what he was thinking. She'd asked him to leave. He'd said he would, but then he'd grabbed her. She'd struggled. He'd panicked. He'd put his hands around her throat, he said, just trying to make her be quiet, just trying to make her stop fighting. She'd gone limp. He'd laid her on the floor. He'd tried to revive her, he said, but she wasn't breathing. Clear's throat. Detective Martinez sat across from this old man as he described taking Patricia Torres' life, and she kept her voice steady when she asked what he'd done next. He said he'd panicked completely. He'd wrapped her in a blanket from her bedroom. He'd carried her to his truck, which was parked just down the street, exactly where the search dogs had lost the scent. He'd driven out into the desert northeast of town to an area he knew, remote and isolated. He'd buried her in a wash, covering the grave with rocks. He'd driven home, cleaned out his truck, burned the blanket. He'd waited for someone to come, for someone to ask questions, but no one had. Days passed. Weeks. He'd continued his life, going to work, driving through town, seeing the missing person posters with Patricia's face on them. He'd thought about turning himself in 1,000 times, but fear had kept him silent. Fear, and the growing sense that maybe he could live with what he'd done, maybe time would make it more bearable, but time hadn't made it more bearable. He said he thought about Patricia Torres every day. He dreamed about her. He saw her face when he closed his eyes. For 15 years he'd carried this, and he was tired. He was old and tired, and when Detective Martinez had knocked on his door, part of him had felt relief. Detective Martinez asked if he could show them where he'd buried Patricia. He said he could try, but the desert changes, erosion and flash floods alter the landscape. Still, he knew the general area. On October 9, 2003, Leonard Watkins led a team of investigators and cadaver dogs to a remote area, approximately 18 miles northeast of Farmington. He pointed to a wash, a dry creek bed lined with rocks. He said it was somewhere in there. The search team began carefully removing stones. They found remains 2 days later, buried approximately 4 feet down, wrapped in degraded fabric. The medical examiner determined the remains were human, female, approximately the right age and height. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew in their bones. The remains belonged to Patricia Torres. Leonard Watkins was arrested and charged with second-degree ending of life. He entered a guilty plea on February 4, 2004. In a hearing before the judge, with the Torres family sitting in the courtroom behind him, Leonard Watkins read a prepared statement. He said he was sorry, a word that couldn't possibly contain the magnitude of what he'd done. He said he'd taken a life, destroyed a family, and lived as a coward for 15 years. He said he deserved whatever punishment the law allowed. The judge sentenced him to 50 years, the maximum possible. Leonard Watkins would die in prison. He passed away from natural causes in 2011, 7 years into his sentence. For the Torres family, the revelation brought a mixture of grief and closure. Rosa Torres, now 71 years old, attended every court hearing. She sat in the front row and looked at Leonard Watkins and tried to understand how someone could do what he'd done. She never found an answer that satisfied her. Miguel Torres, whose health had deteriorated over the years of not knowing, died 4 months after his daughter's remains were found. Danny Torres said later that at least his father had known at the end what happened to Patricia. That small knowledge, that terrible certainty, had been something. Patricia Torres was finally laid to rest at St. Mary's Cemetery in Farmington on March 20, 2004. The funeral was attended by hundreds, family, friends, community members who'd never forgotten her. The priest spoke about justice, about patience, about faith in truth eventually emerging. Rosa Torres stood at the graveside and looked at the coffin, holding what remained of her daughter, and thought,